At 95, Clint Eastwood finally revealed the 6 names he could never forgive. 6 people who walked through his life and left scars deeper than time itself. He didn't speak with anger or regret, only with a rough, quiet voice, as if reading his own verdict aloud. These names weren't strangers. They once shared film sets, champagne, and applause. But behind every smile and handshake hid something colder, a look of disdain, a quiet betrayal, a wound that never healed. And tonight, those 6 stories will unfold. Not to judge, but to understand why a man who has lived through nearly a century still carries a list of those he hated most. Because sometimes, the people we despise the most are the ones who made us who we are. John Wayne, the clash between 2 Americas. They were never friends, though both became the faces of the American West. John Wayne believed in the old-fashioned hero, brave, patriotic, loud, and unapologetically righteous. Clint Eastwood, when he emerged in a fistful of dollars, was the opposite, a man of few words, morally gray, detached, almost indifferent to good or evil. To Wayne, that wasn't progress. It was betrayal. In a 1971 interview, Wayne said, "I don't understand why people admire men who have no sense of justice." Everyone knew who he meant. Eastwood didn't respond publicly. He only told a friend. He still thinks the world stopped in 1950. Wayne once sent Eastwood a script, a classic Western about courage and honor. He wanted Clint to play a young drifter who learns heroism from an old gunslinger. Eastwood read the first few pages and sent it back. "That story belongs to a country that doesn't exist anymore," he said. Wayne was furious. He called Clint a lost cowboy with no roots. From that day on, they never spoke again. Years later, when Wayne died, a reporter asked if Eastwood regretted never reconciling. He paused for a moment and said quietly, "We were looking at 2 different sides of the same country." Their conflict went beyond cinema. It was philosophy. Wayne believed America was a dream that never changed. Eastwood believed that dream had already decayed, and what was left was survival in the ruins. If Wayne was faith, Eastwood was confession. One spoke through gunfire, the other through silence. Both defined America, but 2 Americas that could never coexist. And that is why, at the end of his life, when asked who he could never forgive, Clint Eastwood answered, John Wayne. Because he never learned to see the world as it really became. Gene Hackman, The Cold War on set. On the set of Unforgiven in 1992, there were 2 kinds of silence, the one Clint Eastwood demanded, and the one Gene Hackman created. Both men were legends. Both ruled their craft with precision, and both refused to bend. The crew called it the Quiet War. Eastwood, as director, ran his set like a monastery. No shouting, no ego, no chaos. Every order was calm, every pause deliberate. Hackman, fiery and instinctive, came from another school, loud rehearsals, forceful improvisations, dominance through energy. From the first week of filming, their worlds collided. Hackman questioned camera angles, challenged line readings, argued about motivation. Eastwood listened, said little, then whispered, "I don't direct by arguing." The tension thickened. By mid-shoot, they communicated only through the assistant director. When Hackman exploded during a take, throwing his hat to the ground, Eastwood simply turned and walked away. The next morning, Hackman found new directions waiting on his chair, rewritten scenes. No conversation. The film's intensity was born from that conflict. Hackman's sheriff radiated rage. Eastwood's camera captured it with surgical coldness. What audiences saw as brilliance was, in truth, a power struggle disguised as art. When Unforgiven swept the Oscars, Eastwood stood alone on stage, calm as always. Hackman wasn't there. He later said in an interview, "Clint makes silence look like control." Eastwood never replied. Years later, when asked about Hackman, he said, "We made something great together. That was enough." They never spoke again. No reunions. No reconciliations. No warmth. Two craftsmen who touched perfection but lost any trace of friendship along the way. To Eastwood, Hackman represented everything he despised in Hollywood noise mistaken for passion, emotion mistaken for truth. Yet he also respected him for it, in the way one soldier respects another after battle. It was not hatred born from betrayal, but from exhaustion, the fatigue of two men who could not share the same silence. And so, when the subject of enemies came up decades later, Eastwood smiled faintly and said, "Hackman. Not because he wronged me, but because he reminded me too much of myself." Sean Penn, the public disrespect. The tension began long before Mystic River. Sean Penn had always admired Clint Eastwood, the filmmaker, but not the man. To him, Eastwood represented everything wrong with old Hollywood's stoic masculinity. Conservative ideals, quiet authority. When Eastwood offered him the lead role, Penn accepted, but not out of reverence. He wanted to test the legend. From the first day on set, their energy clashed. Eastwood spoke little, preferring long pauses and minimal direction. Penn filled the silence with questions, debates, and bursts of improvisation. "You're not supposed to feel it," Eastwood once said after a take. "You're supposed to be it." Penn smirked. "That's the problem. I am it." Their conflict spilled beyond the set. During press interviews, Penn called Eastwood a relic, the last cowboy who still believes in the good guy with a gun. It was meant as a joke, but the words stuck. Eastwood stayed silent. When the film premiered, critics called Penn's performance his best. On Oscar night, he won. He thanked the cast, the crew, even his rivals, but not Clint Eastwood. Cameras caught Eastwood clapping, expressionless. Afterward, a journalist asked Eastwood if he was offended. He replied simply, "I don't expect gratitude from people who still think they're fighting the system." That was the end of it publicly. Privately, he never forgot. Years later, when both were asked to appear together at a tribute event, Eastwood declined. "I don't share stages with men who think noise makes them brave." Penn responded with another jab. "I guess silence is courage now." The feud became a quiet fixture of Hollywood gossip, two generations locked in mutual disdain. Yet beneath the pride, there was something deeper, reflection. Eastwood once told a friend, "He reminds me of me, but louder, angrier, and less sure of what he's fighting." It was the closest he ever came to forgiveness. For Penn, the disdain never softened. In later interviews, he still referred to Eastwood as the director who made a masterpiece by doing nothing. To Eastwood, that sentence said everything about the difference between them. Penn performed emotion, Eastwood stripped it bare. They never met again. No handshake, no apology, no final word. Just distance, the kind that outlives both anger and respect. When asked decades later if there was anyone he truly disliked, Eastwood paused before answering. Sean Penn, he said quietly. Because sometimes, contempt is just the echo of disappointment. Madonna, the war of egos. Their worlds were never meant to collide, but in Hollywood, ambition always finds a way. In the early 90s, Madonna approached Clint Eastwood with an offer to direct a stylized musical drama she wanted to star in. She believed Eastwood's gravitas could elevate her image from pop provocateur to serious actress. Eastwood declined without hesitation. Art, he said, isn't supposed to serve anyone's vanity. Madonna took it personally. Within weeks, her publicist leaked that Eastwood didn't understand strong women. She mocked his stoicism on television, saying, "He's the kind of man who thinks silence makes him deep." Eastwood didn't respond. He didn't need to. Silence was his reply. And in Hollywood, that kind of silence is louder than any insult. Years later, when asked if he ever regretted turning her down, Eastwood said, "I don't direct people who try to control the camera instead of earning it." It was a clean shot, quiet, precise, final. Their feud evolved into symbolism. Madonna represented the new Hollywood, loud, performative, fueled by publicity. Eastwood stood for the old, disciplined, restrained, built on craft and patience. They were both right in their own time and both unwilling to yield an inch. When Madonna released a music video parodying classic westerns, tabloids noted the timing, the imagery dust, pistols. Loneliness felt like a challenge. Someone asked Eastwood if he'd seen it. He only smiled and said, "Some people imitate what they don't understand." Behind that calm remark lay a truth he rarely admitted. He respected her drive, even if he despised her method. They were mirror opposites, two creators chasing immortality through entirely different means. He built legacy through silence. She built it through noise. In one rare interview, Eastwood explained the difference. "She wants to be seen," he said. "I just want it to last." That was the heart of their conflict. Fame, for Madonna, was oxygen. For Eastwood, it was poison. They never spoke again, never crossed paths at an award show or charity gala. Yet their quiet feud became an unspoken chapter in Hollywood folklore, the pop queen and the cowboy who refused to direct her spotlight. When asked near the end of his career if he ever disliked someone truly, Eastwood didn't hesitate. "Madonna," he said. "Not because she offended me, but because she reminded me of what Hollywood was becoming." It wasn't hatred. It was grief for an era he knew was ending. Spike Lee, The Public War. The conflict began in 2 sentences. Spike Lee, during an interview in 2008, said Clint Eastwood erased black soldiers from history and flags of our fathers. Eastwood heard the quote while editing another film. He didn't shout. He didn't explain. He simply said, "I tell stories, not sermons." That was the start of a war fought in public, not with guns, but with microphones. Spike Lee accused Eastwood of whitewashing American heroism. Eastwood replied, calm but sharp, he should shut his face. The press turned it into spectacle, the old lion versus the new rebel, the quiet conservative versus the outspoken activist. Every headline, every quote, widened the divide. Behind the scenes, studio executives begged them to reconcile. Neither wanted to. Lee doubled down, saying, "Clint lives in a fantasy where only white men save the world." Eastwood, when asked to respond, said only, "History doesn't need permission to be honest." It wasn't just about race, it was about control. Lee believed in using cinema as a weapon for justice. Eastwood believed in letting the audience find their own truth. To him, Lee's outrage was theater. To Lee, Eastwood's silence was complicity. Their feud became a reflection of Hollywood itself, two filmmakers representing two Americas. Each convinced the other was blind. Critics chose sides. Younger directors praised Lee's courage. Older veterans defended Eastwood's restraint. Neither man ever apologized. Years later, when Lee won an honorary Oscar, Eastwood was invited to present it. He refused. "I don't do pretend peace," he said. When a journalist asked if time had softened his anger, he answered, "Time doesn't heal arrogance." For Eastwood, the conflict was never about ideology, it was about pride. He saw in Lee a version of himself he didn't like, defiant, confrontational, unwilling to bend. What separated them wasn't belief, but temperament. One shouted to be heard, the other believed silence spoke louder. And yet, deep down, Eastwood respected him. In private, he once admitted, he fights for what he believes in. I can't hate that, but I can hate the noise it makes. They never met. No handshake. No truce. No ending. Just two men, each convinced his vision of America was the truer one. When Eastwood was later asked who among his critics hurt him the most, he paused longer than usual. Then he said quietly, "Spike Lee." Because he made me realize that even truth depends on who's telling it. Michael Moore, the final trigger. Their feud began with a sentence and ended with a threat. Michael Moore had mocked Clint Eastwood's politics for years, calling him a fossil of the American myth. Eastwood ignored it until 2005, when Moore's documentary Bowling for Columbine won an Oscar and used footage from one of Eastwood's films to criticize gun culture. That crossed a line. At a press event soon after, Eastwood said dryly, "If he ever comes to my house, I'll kill him." The crowd laughed, but the silence that followed told everyone it wasn't entirely a joke. Moore replied on national TV, calling Eastwood a man who confuses quiet with wisdom. Eastwood didn't answer. He didn't need to. Their dispute became a symbolic clash between two Americas, one defending tradition, one tearing it down. Moore represented outrage. Eastwood embodied restraint. Yet both were driven by the same obsession, truth. The difference was how they sought it. Moore used confrontation, Eastwood used distance. When asked years later if he regretted the remark, Eastwood smirked. "I was just reminding him there are doors you don't knock on." It was vintage Clint calm. Ironic. Lethal. Moore fired back with another film, Fahrenheit 9/11, slipping in a subtle jab about actors who mistake silence for depth. The two never met. Reporters tried to orchestrate reconciliations, photo ops, debates. Eastwood refused every time. "I don't argue with people who build careers by shouting," he said. For him, Moore wasn't a rival, he was a symptom of what Hollywood had become: loud, performative, self-righteous. Still, beneath that contempt was understanding. Eastwood once told a journalist off record, "He believes in his country, just like I do. We just see different storms on the same horizon." It was as close to forgiveness as he would ever get. In his later years, when politics once again divided America, Eastwood was asked what he thought of Michael Moore now. He leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, "He's still talking. I stopped listening." But those words carried something softer: fatigue. Not fury. Hate. To Eastwood, had aged into something quieter: resignation. The kind that comes when you've outlived both your enemies and your reasons to fight. For all the headlines and sound bites, their feud wasn't about ideology. It was about the clash between noise and silence, between a man who demanded to be heard and another who believed silence was the only way to stay sane. And that is why, when asked near the end of his life who he still couldn't forgive, Clint Eastwood smiled and said, Michael Moore. Because he taught me that not every fight deserves an answer, but some still deserve a scar. 6 names. 6 grudges. 6 reminders that even legends bleed. Behind Clint Eastwood's calm voice and quiet stare was a lifetime of conflict, not with the world, but with what the world made of him. Each name he mentioned carried a different weight: pride, betrayal, disappointment, and the quiet ache of men who never said what they truly felt. To outsiders, these feuds looked like anger. To him, they were memory. Every clash, every silence, every refusal shaped the man he became, the cowboy who didn't need to draw his gun to win. Hatred, in his hands, was never noise. It was discipline. Now, at 95, he no longer carries revenge, only recollection. The faces of Wayne, Hackman, Penn, Madonna, Lee, and more drift somewhere between contempt and understanding. They are the ghosts of a long career, not enemies, but mirrors. And perhaps that is the final truth Clint Eastwood wanted to leave behind, that in Hollywood, love fades, admiration lies, but hate endures. Because it remembers. In the end, the 6 people he could never forgive weren't just the ones who wounded him. They were the ones who taught him who he really was.